Hey, thank you all for coming today. This is the penultimate talk of the Lebanon series, which we curated as a response to the horrific explosion that happened in Lebanon. The aim of this series is to highlight Lebanese creatives living both in Lebanon and in the diaspora, while also highlighting various NGOs or charities that we could donate to. Today, our speaker, Elsa Saade, will talk about Embrace Lebanon. Elsa will be introduced by Amiel Al-Karai. Amiel teaches at Queen's College and the Graduate Center, CUNY. Amiel is a poet, novelist, translator, critic, scholar, and also takes on multiple roles in the public sphere. In the 1980s, he worked with many grassroots organizations in Israel and Palestine, while also reporting on torture and political prisoners for Amnesty and other human rights groups. Edward Said, among others, have praised his book, After Jews and Arabs. He was given a 2017 American Book Award from the Before Columbus Foundation for his work as founder and general editor of Lost and Found, the CUNY Poetics Document Initiative. Elsa, please tell us about Embrace.
Sure. Hi, everyone. So Embrace is a nonprofit organization. It works to raise awareness around mental health in Lebanon. Their largest accomplishment to date is their Embrace Lifeline 1564. That makes sure that there is suicide prevention. It's a suicide prevention helpline in Lebanon. And they also made a small support group here in New York for us after the explosion. So I really feel like their work is the type of work that really needs to be supported, because mental health is such a taboo in Lebanon. And that's why they need to be much more supported. And they're a part of the base camp in Lebanon with other NGOs, providing every type of support they can right now in terms of mental health. If you want to know more about them, their website is embracelebanon.org.
Thank you, Lara. Thanks everyone for coming. I'm just going to give a very brief intro. I'm very happy to be here and to be able to respond to Elsa's work. So I'll just read a brief bio before Elsa takes off with it. Elsa Saade is a Lebanese cultural and social activist, aspiring historian, political artist, and mobilizer based in New York City. You may also know she's a singer. Currently works as a program officer at a feminist grant-making organization called Urgent Action Fund. She holds a master's degree in Middle Eastern Studies from the City University of New York's Graduate Center, focused on the concept of silenced histories and the case of the disappeared in post-Civil War Beirut. And I'll just say she did her work with two wonderful colleagues of mine, Samira Haj and Sharia Talagani, and also Simon Davis, three actually. In parallel to her day-to-day work, Elsa's interest and skills surround the fields of feminist human rights, digital security, advocacy, Middle Eastern history, politics and activism, Artivism, philanthropy and justice. Elsa grew up in Lebanon and moved to New York to pursue her studies, all the while holding her dream for strategic and collective change in her region by and through local communities. So, Elsa, please.
I'm just going to say I am so thrilled to be here, one. Two, I'm extremely honored to have my moderator be Amiel, who's been a beautiful supporter of mine in the past year and who's been a beautiful friend, if I may say. And I want to say that what I love about Majlis and what I love about being here is the fact that the way it happens, it really is reviving the oral tradition of sharing and listening to one another, which is something I learned from my poet friends like Camelia, who's amongst us today. And I would love to revive that tradition within academia too, which is why today I'd love to share with you the introduction of my thesis, which I wrote last year, that roams around the concept of silence and absences, but in the context of Lebanon particularly, and in the context of the case of the disappeared also particularly. I'm also going to mention that today is the anniversary of the first day of the revolution in Ecuador last year. And in a few days or a few weeks, it will be the anniversary of our revolution in Lebanon. So I needed to plug that in. All right, here goes. Strolling in Beirut after 80 days from the day the revolution had started, after I had left it for a year, I could see how the space had changed. Concrete walls that had been empty turned into an open open-air museum of graffiti art, ranging from a drawing of a martyr's face to a caricature of the corrupt and slogans of the revolution, to a statement like Ali loves Rita, sprayed on a corner of the street by an aspiring amateur. I could see how civilians' experience of space changed, reclaiming previously empty public spaces, making them into their homes, living in them as an expression of revolt against the system of corruption and oppression they had lived through for 30 years. I discovered an old cinema that would normally have been surrounded by internal security forces and high fences, now populated by a couple of mattresses and a graffiti that said, and I quote, "I promise on your life, mama, I'm not leaving this place, even if you disapprove of me," end quote. I walked up to the egg, or the dome, an old egg-shaped brutalist design built in the late 60s, destined to be an opera house or a cinema interrupted by the Lebanese civil war and kept off limits for years. I spoke with strangers about their demands, asked them why they keep on revolting after 70 days of relentless protests, and got to know their shy histories. They spoke of different ways of revolting through their purchasing power, closing roads, archiving, organizing, using violence, or committing to nonviolent protests. And I could see the multitude of revolutionary tactics, a multitude of experiences. I could not set one standard and write one story that would sum up all the experiences of revolutionaries in Beirut. But what I could sense is a break from the old order of time, a type of presentism tied to a silenced past and an achingly hopeful future. And as I write back then, I'll note that Lebanon's revolution has been livid on the streets of Beirut, Saida, Jounia, Tripoli, and many more cities for over 200 days. Now almost a year, kind of. We've lost 6 civilians, and due to the economic crackdown of private banks, including capital controls and the Lebanese central bank's unwillingness to stop the inflation of local currency, many have crouched into the lower classes. What was most interesting to me, though, is how this perspective break from the past and the now open-air museum of experience and color entangled itself with the visual break I discovered in Ghassan Halwani's film, Erased, Ascent of the Invisible. Without specifying the location, Halwani visits a wall in Beirut with a cutter in hand. He starts peeling off layers of posters from the wall until he goes around 5 centimeters deep. And slowly, without commentary, we can see older layers under the multitude of posters glued over them for years. He keeps digging until we can see a black and white print, which I suppose is from the 80s, stating, "We love Beirut, and if they assassinated her, it is in our memory that she lives on." The second frame from that wall was the unpeeling of more layers leading up to the face of a man side by side with other faces of men who had been put together up on the walls of Beirut, a tactic adopted by families of the disappeared as a plea to find them. The walls of Beirut, in both those instances, illustrated the way generations of Lebanese civilians demand the articulation of a fragmented past by acting and demanding from the present. But what are 200 days of revolution compared to almost 5,475 days of civil war? François Hartog would probably state, "The present dictates." In Hartog's discussion of time, we could understand historical time as part of being in the world and experiencing it, and how that relates to future anticipation or no future anticipation, depending on the regime of historicity we are in. And the regime of historicity basically sheds light on the temporality, either past, present, or future, around which the order of time is structured and experienced at various conjunctions in history. Futurism, as Hartog argues, contains an order of time that places particular demands on the present to sacrifice itself for the future, while presentism contains an order of time in which the present takes precedence and is omnipresent. Today's omnipresent COVID-19 outbreak really serves as an oddly poignant illustration of Hartog's point of time, determined by things that are no longer and things that are not yet. With news coming out of Hart Island in New York, displaying satellite imagery of mass graves being dug for over 5,000 COVID-19 dead-ridden bodies, the city's sirens break through the silence of public spaces as people confine themselves at home. Death surrounds us, and our fate is not as known as we would have liked it to be. And while I'm sad for those lives that we lose daily, my heart feels content that today we've all touched uncertainty somehow. In Lebanon, The mothers of the disappeared have lived through that type of uncertainty for over 30 years. Even though the civil war had supposedly ended in 1990, Beirut got rebuilt, and a general public discourse of healing by not revisiting the past became the mainstream discourse, suppressing past experiences and memories, stacking poster over poster for years on end. And the family's spatial experience of Beirut, however, was still attached to the moment that their loved ones disappeared and the possibility of their walking on mass graves of other families disappeared. The past could still find its way into the present with a material absence of a body that can still be alive or that is dead and unrecognized. On Ghassan Halwani's family register, his father's name still remains unremoved. Officially, as per the state's records, Adnan is recognized as a right-holding present citizen, while his body is effectively nowhere to be found. Adnan Halwani was supposedly being taken for a 5-minute chit-chat on the 24th of September 1982. These 5 minutes turned to 38 years of waiting for him to come back. Wadat Halwani, Adnan's partner, initially told her young kids, Ghassan and Ziad, that their father was traveling. She wrote them letters from their father and promised his return soon, illustrative of the faith Wadad had in the return of Adnan. But Adnan never came back, deeming Wadad's experience of the civil war's outcomes imminent, where the past could make a constant claim of her present. Since Adnan's disappearance, and after having heard about several other disappearances, she went to a local radio station and asked, live on radio, whoever has had a person disappear in their family to meet her at a specific time by the Mosque of Abdel Nasser in Corniche al-Masra, which was near the school she taught in. The next day, she goes to the meeting place expecting the small group she was eagerly waiting to meet, and she describes the scene as follows, and I quote, "What I saw was amazingly scary. The 2, 3, or 4 women I expected to attend turned out in the hundreds, some accompanied by a number of children. The meeting square was full. The place was packed with people who did not know each other. Did these women answer my call in order to simply get to know each other? Certainly not. It was not time for socializing or entertainment, nor did the streets really allow it. They had come to know what has happened to them." End quote. The women marched towards the Council of Ministers building, each in her turn lamenting the disappearance of a son or daughter, a brother, a husband, and more, up until they were met with a group of armed soldiers who had been ordered to stop the commotion. After a struggle to stay, a media outpour, and a representative from the government coming down to speak with the women, their journey of meeting with leaders of militias, presidents, and many more started, asking for the truth. And their get-together became a daily one eventually, which has not stopped till today. It was only after 36 years of sit-ins in Beirut, constant campaigning and protests, that in November 2018, the parliament passed a law on the missing and disappeared, enabling mass graves and enable a tracing process, end quote, which might lead to the closure of some cases. On an informal call with Wadad, the head of the committee of the families of the disappeared in Lebanon, she exclaimed, "I believe our cause was the womb of the October 17 revolution. Our tent gave birth to the many tents in downtown Beirut today, and it remains in Gibran's garden facing the UNESCO building. Many protests and stands of solidarity started from the tent, effectively, and several grassroots discussions were around the tent in October. However, the tent was torn and empty when I visited in December. A statement Wadad answered me with, 'Elsa, they're tired. Many of them have died. Ahmed, if you remember her, the one with the bent back and the blue boxes of Gitan cigarettes, she's so old she can barely walk.' That tent is still surrounded with banners of pictures and the number 17,000, indicating the iconographic series of faces that had disappeared over 15 years, which we also see on the walls, right? Very rightly so, Wadad also questions, if the cause of the disappeared had been heard and answered, would there have been a need for revolution? In other words, would there have been a need for the past to loom around the present silently as much as it has?" So this was the introduction of my thesis. Mind you, I wrote it last year, so there's so much that I would want to share more. But this is basically laying the foundations of what I would discuss in my thesis, the revolution itself and how it breaks this silenced past of a violent civil war and its affect. And then the silences in the disappeared cases, absence, and of course, finally, how history itself is written in Lebanon and about Lebanon, just generally, and how violent it can be and silencing it can be, and has been. And of course, to take a step back, I have personal history with this silence, as I think many of us do on this call. I had it in my home, with my own father, with my own family, which is why I'd like to share the following story with you, which is mainly the introduction to my second chapter, which delves further into the concept of absence, its materiality, immateriality, and how it can be both. But it's too long, so I can't share it here, even though I'd love your thoughts on it eventually. But this is more of a personal story to make sense of why I'm so interested in all of this. I remember very vividly when my father took us to our village, Meiruba, to visit my grandparents' graves. He found the church and went down a narrow staircase leading to a small room guarded by a black iron gate. I looked inside and I could see 2 rows of 6 boxes. And I asked my father, "Wain Jaddo Aziz u Teta Lor? Where are Jaddo Aziz and Teta Lor?" Which he answered me by saying, "Just pray for their souls, Baba." When I grew older, I asked him if we could go visit again. And to my surprise, he tells me that their bodies had been thrown into a well a long time ago. Meiruba did not have its own graves. It only had this one room in which all its dead would lie until their body decomposed, and then they're thrown into this well. My father might not have a place to come back to and find my grandparents' decomposed bodies. However, he goes back to the place in which they were first buried as a point of reference to the moment he had to say goodbye. I still don't know where the well is, but what I do know from stories I'm told is that Jaddo Aziz had the kindest soul, Allah yarhamu, and he died because of a weak heart. My dad would always remind us of how Jaddo Aziz's heart became weaker after his son's battle in Sanin. A battle my father was very proud of, the only battle he spoke of that I remember from my childhood. And I quote, "We were supposed to rest on the top of a mountain after a battle against the Syrians," my father told me. "And the moment we arrived, bombs of phosphorus rained on us. They were waiting for us up there." My father lost his men on that day, and only him and one of his men were able to survive by throwing themselves down the mountain, rolling until they reached the mountain's base. News of the attack and deaths traveled to Nahr al-Mot, where my grandfather lived and where my father started his militant journey. And that's when my father's health started deteriorating. It was only last year, though, that the story materialized beyond those personal details. A fellow researcher and I searched through a series of small newspaper clips from the Safir archives. We were looking through the month of April 1981. And while I was in complete denial of my connection to these headlines, the 27th of April arrived with a headline on the front page stating, "Ma'arakat Sanin," the Battle of Sanin. At that moment, I could see how my father's story materialized in the bigger context of the Lebanese Civil War. A battle he led was big and worthy of a front page mentioning. But was my father a hero or a traitor? For a while, I was very distrustful of everything I heard. Did my father take part in the 1982 Sabra and Shatila massacre? Did he stand on checkpoints and kill whoever was not Christian? My father answers me, "I never killed a civilian. And I left everything in 1981 when I saw how many men they were willing to sacrifice for the bigger picture." In 1975, my father and mother were 18-year-old adults. My mother was an aspiring heart surgeon, my father an aspiring lawyer. In 5 years' time, my mother was a retired nurse, mother of a little girl, expecting another little girl, and my father was a phalangist militant. In year 2020, 45 Aprils after 1975, and after the October 17 revolution, my father, for the first time, spoke of his experiences during the Civil War to me. And I'll end it here, and I would love for any questions, anything eventually, like after this call, I would love to talk more about this.
I want to respond, just take a few minutes to respond, and then we can open a discussion. I'll just say some things. I was immediately reminded of a line by a poet friend in Sarajevo, Marko Vesovic, which he wrote post-war in Bosnia. And he says, the speechlessness all around me, harder to pierce than tank armor. And that is precisely what you're dealing with. And about your work and how, when I first read your thesis, how knocked out I was by it. To begin with, you know, you take note of reality, as you can see in that introduction. You know, the open air museum, the palimpsest of the posters. Keep in mind Herodotus, you know, when he went to Egypt, wrote in detail about what he saw. And it's one of the most important historical accounts we have of how a historian can write. But because we're involved in contemporary academia, you know, it's very hard to maintain, I would say, a poetics of being and of writing and of thinking in that context. So when I first read your work, I was really impressed by your ability to be very personal, but absolutely historical, and to be unafraid of using sources at the same time: graffiti, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Fanian, somebody a lot of people don't know about, using the films of Jean Chemoun and May Masri, the novels of Elias Houri, the graffiti, and your own experience, and particularly your relationship with your family, which is the central point of this work, the central point of this work. I also think of a concept by a friend, Jalal Tawfiq, and he writes about the idea of a culture or a people that has undergone a surpassing disaster. And when they have undergone a surpassing disaster, their cultural materials are withdrawn. They can't have access to them. And they have to figure out other ways, find other languages which are almost sequestered from them because they are part of that disaster. So all of these things are things that you know, and also your ability to think about time. Time always moves at different paces in different situations. I think of a great book by George Kubler, The Shape of Time, where he tries to understand how time moves in different contexts and how things connect. Remember, Captain John Smith, of all people, said, history is the memory of time. History is the memory of time. So, you know, it's just great to hear you and to be in this context. And those are like immediate thoughts that I have. And we can just open it up to discussion, thoughts, or if you want to respond to what I said or anybody.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you definitely put your finger on the wound with that quote. And it's like, for instance, during the thesis as well, we talk about how people go back to the moment of death where the cemetery is or where it's not, right? And there's a part where it says like the families of the disappeared in Spain after the Spanish Civil War would go, even though the bodies were exhumed and were taken to other places, would go to the place of the mass grave instead of the place where the bodies were put, right? Because of that moment. So time and its conversation with space and its conversation with how we deal with our with absence and with our lost ones, or whether it's within us or without us or with people we love, or just absence, just loss, is just fascinating to me. And it's much louder than any archive. And since you mentioned the archive as well, for instance, Mike Nishanyan says the genocide is not a fact, and that was like so shocking for me at first. But then eventually he starts saying the archive is so violent, you need to prove over and over again because of the lack of the material things that are around you, right? Or the material things that are in the archive. You need to dig in. And honestly, like that's why I write. I didn't want to write to become an academic. I wanted to write to just like through the academic process to heal, to go back to the source of things, if there is a source of things, to interrogate how I experience time, how I experience place, how I experience loss, how I experience absence, and how all these people around me do that too. And I'm still in conversation with myself. It's a constant conversation, as I'm sure you know, like through your work as well, wherever you went. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say in response to what you mentioned. Yeah, thank you for mentioning all of these. It's so captivating to hear these names as a response to my introduction to my thesis and my thesis just generally. Totally up to you to take this conversation wherever you want, Amian.
Well, I would say, if there are other responses or thoughts, questions.
Elsa, I signed up for this because I saw your name and I thought it was just going to be like a poetry thing. But to find out that it's like about your thesis, and I loved it so much. I don't know if you're done writing it. And if you are, I would love to read it. And when you were talking about like the emphasis of like erasing the past to move on, like in Lebanon, I was thinking of the comparison of like Rwanda and the Rwandan genocide, and how instead they very much held on to the gruesomeness of what happened in their museums. And I don't know, because, it's not like they've healed in Rwanda either. And I wonder if there is a correct way to memorialize or a correct way to heal. And it's also like the different things that you mentioned, I was thinking last semester I took a course on memory and memorialization. So I touched on a lot of those like similar topics, but none of them were in the context of Lebanon. And like listening to you and listening to the different aspects of history and memorialization, and I love that you're working in history and like talking about those things, but you're holding on to that poetic way of writing that's like not necessarily always accepted in academia, and let alone in like history. So like I really appreciate that. And I was thinking of the 2006 war. I don't know if you heard of Majlis Marwahin, but my family from my father's side were in the attack, and my grandma passed away in it. And for that paper, I was planning on writing about memorialization about that, but then COVID happened and I couldn't like open up that trauma. But there's this car that was like right behind the bus that got attacked, and that's where my grandparents were. Anyway, the like whatever is left from that car, it's still there on the entrance of the village. Like the attack didn't happen in the village, but it was moved and it was put there. And I was like always wondering if like having it there is helpful because there's like a place to go to mourn, or if it's like just like a constant reminder, or if the reminder fades by seeing it every day in your everyday life. So yeah, no, I really admire your thesis, and it's so important, and I would love to read it if you're down to sharing it. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you for sharing, Dana, and for joining and for staying, even though this is not poetry. But I thank you for sharing the story. And there's a part of Amiel, is it okay to yeah? There's a part of my thesis where I talk about place and memorialization. There was an architectural plan for a memorial for the disappeared that was set up to be on Beirut's Corniche al-Mazar, a neutral ground, right, where the families of the disappeared and Lebanese civilians would be able to go and contemplate over times of the past and interact with the premises. I mean, that idea would have been great, right? But it was effectively implemented over in the Normandie dump, fifth dock of the Beirut port, which is a mass grave. So today we call it Beirut waterfront, right? This place was a mass grave of people. Like, imagine they're building a memorial for the families of the disappeared over a mass grave. And that moment kind of added a further layer of violence over what already was violent, that state of limbo. So yeah, I absolutely agree with you that it's extremely, and by the way, like this space right now is empty, it's concrete walls, and the waves are just like crashing themselves into silence on those walls, which is extremely symbolic of how it is, right? So studying that place of memorial and the objects of memorializing is so important. I would love to talk to you more about this. It captures something, it means something, especially if you put it in a context of why, how, what does it mean, how does it change with space and time.
Definitely. And then also, if as long as there's no one else, I just want to add one more thing. When you like look at the reference of the museum that's like in South Lebanon by Nasrallah, and I went once there as like to look at it from a propaganda perspective. And there's this one like museum where they have like photos of Israeli soldiers that are like carrying other like soldiers that were attacked. And I don't know, like the idea was that you would look at those photos and you would feel, I don't know, vindicated or restful. But I was just like looking at those photos and I was like, I don't feel any more at peace with the death of my grandmother. Yeah, and that's like a different form of like memorialization that they chose, but it's also very much political. And yeah, it's just like all really interesting, and I definitely want to read your thesis, and I love this so much, and thank you for sharing.
It's so difficult to memorialize anything. I mean, it's difficult enough for oneself to remember something, that actually is, that actually is significant, and to come to remembrance, and so I'm just thinking of the US. There are so few places where there, I think, is authentic memorialization. And I'm thinking of one particular place that's very close to me that I know, which is in Gloucester, Massachusetts. There's a statue to lost fishermen. And it goes from the 1700s, there are names of people to the present, because there's still fishermen getting lost. And there's a memorial every year when people come and throw flowers into the sea. And it's one of the few places I can think of in the US where there's a memorial to workers, who have lost their lives in getting food, essentially, in getting food. And it's very powerful, and it's very present in the town. It's very much a presence, and it's very rare for that to exist anywhere. Almost, it's very difficult to find that, because it's so co-opted, and it's so politicized and taken over in so many ways. So the fact that your own work is an act of memorialization, first of all, for yourself, but then it enables other people to find their way to memories, to methods of memorialization, to finding ways, even what Dana just said about that car, how do you deal with it? How do you even begin to deal with it, and to think about that, and to examine that, so yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a poem that I love by Makhlouf. One of nothingness's responsibilities is to devour stars, one star after the other. The black hole is the visible side of the universe. And even though this sounds so morbid, it really shows that it's all in the gaps. Like when you look at the sky, you see stars, right? But there's something in between. There's a gap that is full of life as well, that is full of something else that you really need to understand in a way or another sometimes. Like sometimes you don't. You just want to look at the stars. But denying the fact that there's something between those stars that your eye is seeing is basically how the system is in Lebanon today, and in so many other places, like you mentioned, even here in the US or other places. So if we don't think about these things, we tend to just forget about them and yeah.
The most important thing is, you make history yourself. If you don't make it, somebody else makes it for you,
Definitely.
And that's the key to everything,
Absolutely. What is the name of the poem, Makhlouf? It's called Coloring the Seasons. I can send you the link here.
It's such a pleasure to get to see this. Can you read this again? Because I saw the first thesis reading and I'm like continuing my notes, and it's just very generative. So please forgive me as I gather my thoughts and try to ask you a question, because I think that one, like Dana and probably other people here, I think that a lot of the wounds that we have carried throughout generations as like and be it like I'm a child of like my parents went through the Civil War and then they immigrated to America, and so I hold those wounds I've carried, and then there's also the new wounds that continue to be inflicted, the surpassing disaster. And so that like we're just like surviving through and trying to make sense of our lives. And I think that it's so generative what you just opened up, and I wish that this was shared on a wider scale, only because like I think that just interacting with this work is incredibly generative to anybody. We need it, you know, like we need examples of people investigating their own histories, especially the hidden ones, because I think at some point you quote in your thesis a quote, bringing into intelligibility the absence of the absence. And so this idea that like, and especially women's stories, they're the absence of the absence of the absence of the absence of the absence, generation after generation. So never have our stories been sort of like memorialized in such a way. Sappho is a perfect example. So I guess my question for you, because also I've been talking about this ever since I saw you, ever since you gave the first talk, which I've been talking about it with friends who are sort of, I want to refine the, I don't know what the word I'm saying, but I want to refine the argument, because they're like, okay, this issue of the disappeared, it feels abstract to them sometimes. And so what is the relationship for you between this issue of the disappeared and material reality of the everyday right now? And so you talk about it a little bit with the mass graves, but like, can you maybe speak a little bit more? Because this is daily advocacy work that we're doing and developing frameworks as we are talking with our friends and our loved ones. And I think that this, what you're talking about, should be a part of our daily conversations, because I think about my disappeared every freaking day.
Oof, Camelia, you always like make my heart beat so fast when you speak. It's beautiful. And actually, it's a very good point. I do have a case for you, right? And I do mention it at some point in the thesis about Odette and her kids, Richard and Christine. Their case is extremely interesting, because Richard and Christine supposedly disappeared between Mar Mkhayel and Hamra at some point while they were coming back home. And the house that she had rented was in the three of their names. So Odette at some point dies. And the landlord was not able to get the house back. Why? Because Christine and Richard are still alive on the family register. So practically their disappearance, even though it's so immaterial, materialized in a way or another and stopped a process from happening. It stopped it. The landlord up until today is not able to get the house back, because Christine and Richard are the lawful residents of this place. Because back then the contracts were much longer, right? It's not like every year contract. It was a much longer contract, and the three of their names were there. So this is one example of how that immateriality actually ties down back into the very, very material day-to-day life. And that's talking about like a contract, right? Aside from talking about like how it really materializes in us and in the space around us. So yeah, that's one example that I can give you, that I thought of when you were asking me that question. Yeah. I hope I answered your question, Camilio. Yeah. Okay.
So you had mentioned when you were doing the introduction for your thesis, you talked a little bit about, I think it was Hartog's theories of time. And you mentioned a little bit about the difference between presentism and futurism. And sort of my question for you is, which of these ideologies do you feel like is more suited for the transitional period that the people of Lebanon are in? And how do you sort of navigate the fact that a lot of times Arab governments have this tendency to use futurism to sort of put off like current satisfaction and current pleasures and things like that?
Very tricky question, even though my answer is always like the present dictates. honestly. The present in all its layers, really. That futurism that we think about is, it's very tactical of someone to kind of, it's like a puppetry, you know, like no one can actually tell you what the future is, you know, like really. So whoever builds up towards a grandiose future, which the Lebanese state really did, right, is just, and in my thesis I talk about how it actually kind of shuts down any type of conversation about the past, which is so important for now. Not to heal something that, like in the past, in your past self, to heal something that is now. And by healing it, you're really giving yourself credit in the present, which will affect the future, whether we like it or not, right? So I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I'm going to be able to answer your question properly, but I really think in any process that you go through as a historian or as someone who's critical about a certain question, who's questioning, I would always think about now. And by the way, whatever I write now. Like I always say, maybe in a year or two, I might change because I'm just really tied to the person I am today. In terms of the geopolitics, I'm not going to go into that. I think Amiel unmuted and he wanted to talk about something in relation to that. I'm not sure.
Yeah. No, yeah, that's a great question. You know, I think the issue is really, you know, it's like that, you know, how do you, it's really more predicting the past that will emerge, you know, and how history shaped the present, conceptions of history, and, you know, what is given prominence, what is allowed to not be silenced, what struggles to emerge, you know, all of those things. I mean, I have a memory of a guy that I knew for many years in Split in Croatia, who basically had no jaw, okay, and it was always assumed until the war in the 90s, it was always assumed that you know, that took place by the hands of Croatian fascists, Ustaše. But it emerged as he began to tell his story in the 90s that that wasn't the case. So here you have this person who his whole life, the whole community thought one thing and had a whole narrative based on that supposed reality, which was not real. And the war, what happened in the war enabled him to start telling what actually happened to him. So, you know, as the future is completely predicated on what past is constructed and is created and is brought to light, you know, because otherwise it can't happen. You know, otherwise it's almost like a vacuum. It just gets, you know, sucked into the structures that dictate, you know, who holds power and how.
So
Yeah.
with that understanding of futurism, where it's sort of predicated on what happened in the past, is there really a need for having the concept of futurism, right? Since it's consistently built on like, well, what's happened in the past. Do you think that there's utility in it?
Great question. I don't know.
Absolutely.
I don't know. It's a really great. It's a very profound question. I don't know. I mean, you know, in an aspirational sense, I mean, in other words, it's helpful. Like, well, how would one want things to be, or what would one want to see, or how would one? I mean, if you think of it in an indigenous sense, you know, well, what are we looking at 5, 6, 7 generations down the line? What would things look like? You know, how would things sustain themselves? That kind of concept of a future, you know.
I mean, being hypnotized by the future as well is very, I mean, what's the point of it if you don't have everything you need now? I mean, I didn't know anything about the disappeared before I went to the tent and I spoke to them. And the moment I was like, what? 17,000 disappeared? I've lived all my life without even knowing that we had disappeared. And then when my father, who's right here with us now, spoke to me about his experiences, I'm like, excuse me? Like, how did I not know this before? This really does make me understand so many more things about myself, about my positioning in the world, and that, whether I like it or not, is going into my future, which has happened and is happening as we speak. You know, it's like, it's just a matter of how whole do you want to be as you go into the future, because if you're not whole enough, you're just dragging a person with gaps everywhere, you know. You're just like full of gaps, full of absences, full of nothingnesses that could have been filled. So I personally wouldn't bother with the future because I'm bothering with it by thinking of my present.
Yeah.
You know? But of course, I'll put it much better than I could.
No,
thank you for the question, Ahmed.
No problem.
Sure. I mean, it's a very short song. It's yeah. I'll just sing it. I don't know if it's gonna sound good. It's on Zoom and all, and it's a very small space I'm in right now. Yeah, I was struggling about what I wanted to sing for you all. But yeah, here goes. العصفور بيعود وعلى الوعد العصفور بيعود حلم محفور رغم انه زعفران اختفى غياب الحبايب مغفور غياب الحبايب مغفور الطقس ما بيهدى بيتغير والعصفور ما بيهدى بيغير والقلب ما بيهدى بيغار بس على الوعد الهادي الصوت بيشفى والقلب يروح مع الريح لقاء موعود خيطان ملون الدور عالوعد العصفور بيعود عالوعد العصفور بيعود Habibi. I don't know if the sound was good, but it's a song that I wrote after a very close friend of mine I call her Lasfura, left New York back to Beirut. And once I realized the importance of realizing two homes or homes wherever you are. And that really also ties back to absence, because I'm absent where my parents are now. I'm absent where Beirut is now. And when I'm in Beirut, I'm absent where New York City is and where my family here is. And it's a constant state of limbo, which is not comparable to the families of the disappeared and the state of limbo they're in, but it's limbo, it's life. It dances around it. Absence dances around it, and time and its shape, as you said, Amiel, dances around it. So, yeah. Thank you for listening, y'all. Lara, if it's okay, I'd love to hear from Amyal what he'd want everyone to take from this whole thing.
Oh, look, it's just, everything is about relationships, and trust, and being able to trust what somebody is saying and where they're coming from, and relating it to themselves, and finding in that some sustenance, to go on in this shitty world, which is filled with pain and horror. It's really unspeakable if you even start to think about it. So, anything you can get from somebody's hard work, which is yours in this case, is very hard work to do that. It's not self-evident, anything that you realized or expressed. So to take it as an example and find things in oneself to go further,
I absolutely agree. And again, thank you so much for
Thank
being
you.
here, Amia. And thank you, Lara, for making this beautiful space. And thanks every
Thank
single
you,
one
Lara.
of you.
Yeah. Thanks
Yeah.
to everyone for coming.